In this presentation, I will discuss assessment: formal, informal, formative, and summative. I will touch upon its difference from evaluation. We'll talk about different methods of assessing learning, modifications that may be necessary when accommodating learners with different needs, and involving students in assessment. If you've written good learning outcomes and have an idea of the learning objects you will work with, it will be much easier to write assessments. Remember from week 3 that a good learning outcome is specific and measurable. That's what we'll use as a basis for creating our learning assessments. What is assessment, and how does it differ from evaluation? Assessment refers to collecting and interpreting both qualitative and quantitative information about how our students perform relative to the learning outcome. The primary purpose of assessment is to improve student learning. Assessments can be formal, like standardized tests supported by data, or they can be informal, like observing a learner as he executes a task. It differs from evaluation in that evaluation involves passing judgment on the value of an instructional session or program in achieving its goals. Learning assessment is part of evaluation, but other factors can also be involved. We'll talk more about evaluation in Step 7, which is in Week 6. This week, we're focusing only on learner assessment. Through assessment, we know just how much our students are learning, and that helps them and us as instructors because we will know where we can adjust our online teaching methods to meet the needs of our online students. Let's look at two forms of assessment: formative and summative. Each is critically important. Formative assessment should happen during our instruction, throughout the lesson, and throughout the course or unit we are facilitating. It's imperative that we include formative assessment for our students and for ourselves. It's more than just grades. Any formative feedback you give to your students along the way is a formative assessment strategy that helps them to gauge their learning, to self-regulate their process so that they can perform to the best of their abilities. Formative assessment helps you as well as an instructor. Why? Because you can adjust your teaching methods during instruction if your formative assessments are telling you that your students just aren't getting it. You will know then that perhaps you need to spend a little more time on the topic, or provide additional practice opportunities, for example, which, as a side note, would also increase confidence, an important motivational goal. Formative feedback is an important part of formative assessment. How do you collect formative feedback from students? There are many ways. You can ask questions to check for understanding. You can have students review the work of their peers. You can collect evidence of student voice, such as asking a student to articulate the learning outcome in her own words. This is especially good for K-12 students. Do they really understand what they're supposed to know or do? This allows you to understand the difference between where the learners are currently with respect to your instruction and where they should be. You're able to identify the gaps. Having this knowledge will allow you to fine-tune your instruction, and if you're in a synchronous online session, this may mean having to adjust your instruction midstream. Let's go over examples of formative assessment. Questioning, as I mentioned, is an excellent one, and in a synchronous session, you can use the chat function in your system for this. Questions can come from you as the instructor, or they can be student-generated. Polling to gauge confidence. Most learning management systems have polling as a function. If not, find a polling app online. You can poll anytime, but one idea is polling right after a quiz to see how challenging students thought the quiz was. Discussion forums allow you to see if students are responding appropriately to your prompts and are great for allowing students to expand on questions and engage in self-assessment. Observations. Yes, these can be made online too. Interacting in a small group activity in a breakout room is an example of where you can observe team behavior. The learner analytics generated by the learning management system can also be explored to find out whether students are actually accessing the learning objects, how often they're contributing to discussions, and when they're visiting. Self-reflection, like you are asked to do each week in these learning modules. Self-reflection is an excellent metacognitive strategy. You'll have a self-reflection on assessment this week, I promise you. Graphic organizers can also be used to assess students' learning. Venn diagrams are an example of a graphic organizer and are helpful in assessing analysis level learning in which students compare and contrast similarities and differences between two items. Concept maps can demonstrate whether students understand and can organize relationships between ideas or concepts. Graded and non-graded quizzes with immediate feedback. An example would be the Challenge Yourself quizzes that are included in this online instruction. It's not graded, but it does serve as a gauge for you to check for understanding. Digital exit tickets help you to later differentiate who needs more instruction the next time you teach. You can look at that data that you collected and say, next week or tomorrow if you're in a K-12 environment, how can I change my instruction just a bit to differentiate and to make it improved for all my learners? It also allows you to identify each student's strengths and weaknesses on a daily or a weekly basis. I've mentioned learner analytics as something available to you in learning management systems. You'll hear more about them in the content creation and the course management modules. Before moving on to summative evaluation, I want to add one more point about formative feedback. You can also give motivational feedback. Lots of times in synchronous teaching, you'll see instructors constantly praising students for their responses or while doing work. Great job! Very good! Nice work! Praise is okay in moderation, but the kind of feedback that is most valuable is informative feedback, even when it comes to motivation. For example, Jose, a 4th grade student, has been persisting on task for quite a while and has almost completed his exercise. You look over his shoulder, virtually speaking, and say, Jose, I can see that you've put a lot of effort into this exercise and it shows. Well done. You're then attributing effort to the good result, and that's what makes it informative. You may also hear of the term corrective feedback, when effort is underway, but there still needs to be additional guidance so that the learner can reach the target. Let's move on to summative assessment. I like this definition from the Glossary of Education Reform. I'll read it. Summative assessments are used to evaluate student learning, skill acquisition, and academic achievement at the conclusion of a defined instructional period, typically at the end of a project, unit, course, semester, program, or school year. They have several criteria. They're used to determine if students have learned what they're expected to learn. Basically, have they achieved the learning outcomes that you defined? They are generally given at the conclusion of a unit of instruction. And often, summative assessments are recorded as scores or grades for a permanent record. But all of this doesn't mean that it's the same for every student.
One of the attributes of universal design for learning that we addressed in week 1 is flexibility.
And whether you're teaching face-to-face or online, as we're focusing on here, you may need to make modifications in your assessments if you have students with differing abilities or special needs. For example, if you're in a school library, you will undoubtedly have some students who have individualized education plans or IEPs. Some may have a 504 plan that addresses modifications needed for a specific disability. Modifications could include giving more time to complete an online test or quiz, or reading questions out loud for a student with dyslexia. Or you may have to modify the construction of the test or the task to be performed in some way to make it possible for the student with special needs to have a successful experience. Both formative and summative assessments are ways to differentiate instruction. What types of summative assessments can be employed? Traditional online assessment measures include, of course, quantitative tests with multiple, matching, true-false, and other automatically scorable items. You can also add qualitative sections to your test, such as open-ended questions or essays, which you would then need to score manually. Authentic assessments are often used in problem-based learning and inquiry-based learning where students solve real problems. Authentic assessment allows students to demonstrate their learning in ways that are as close to real-life applications as possible. For example, and this is a real one that I've used, you might have your LIS graduate student enrolled in your technology course team up with an actual library and librarian to create a solution to a technology-based issue, or to explore a technology opportunity afforded by the library. Your summative assessment could include a combination of work submitted by the student related to the project and feedback from the library. So a few examples of summative assessments then include achievement tests or content knowledge and skills tests, and these can be instructor constructed or they can be standardized tests like state tests. They could be a paper, a research paper on a topic. Summative assessment examples can also include formal interviews with students. They could include projects that are created by the students or presentations by students. Whenever possible, involve students in assessments. It provides greater transparency of the assessment process. More importantly, it will help your students better understand the desired learning outcomes when they have a stake in how the learning will be assessed. They can think about the best ways that make the most of their strengths to demonstrate their learning. And when students are involved, they're more engaged and motivated because they are taking charge of the learning process. Summative assessments can act like formative assessments when you use them to improve a subsequent iteration of a course or lesson that you teach. Assessments are about collecting evidence that we are moving towards the achievement of our learning goals and outcomes. We will use that evidence to improve learning in our students.